which is to say more than 3 decades, we could have resolved the conflict before there was a Hamas, with the Palestine Liberation Organization and then the Palestinian Authority. However, I won't evade the challenge. Let's look at Hamas's record. The United States government recently did a study of Hamas, and this is what it concluded. Hamas has been carefully and consciously adjusting its political program for years and has sent repeated signals that it is ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel. The head of Hamas's Politburo, Khalid Mishal, in March 2008, he said, most Palestinian forces, including Hamas, accept a state on the 1967 borders. Even after Israel's merciless assault on Gaza, what the Goldstone report called a disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. Even after that horrendous Israeli massacre in Gaza, right after, 2 days later, Mr. Michel said, our objective remains the constitution of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, the return of the Israelis to the pre-67 borders, and the right of return of our refugees. That is to say, the UN position, the position of the International Court of Justice. Some people say, what about Hamas's charter? The charter which is filled with, correctly said, anti-Semitic, quite, outrageous statements. But the fact of the matter is, from the mid-1990s, Hamas has rarely, if ever, even referred to its charter. That's not just the position or the view of scholars. It's not just the position or the view of US government agencies. It's also the opinion of Israel's Mossad. That's a fact. In December, just before Israel attacked Gaza, the former head of the Mossad, his name is Ephraim Levy, he said as follows, and let me quote him slowly and carefully. The Hamas leadership has recognized that its ideological goal is not attainable and will not be in the foreseeable future. They are ready and willing to see the establishment of a Palestinian state in the temporary borders of 1967. They know that the moment a Palestinian state is established with their cooperation, they will be obligated to change the rules of the game. They will have to adopt a path that could lead them far from their original ideological goals. Which is to say, in simple English, he says, Hamas, it doesn't want to, it doesn't like to, but it recognizes that it has no option apart from a state on the June 67 borders, even if it will force them to give up on their ideological goals. In recent times, Israel, the United States, they say this isn't enough. Palestinians have to go further. They have to accept the legitimacy of Zionism. They have to accept the legitimacy of Israel. They have to accept that Israel is a Jewish state. So Prime Minister Netanyahu, in June 2009, he said, Palestinians, they have to recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own in this land. That is, Palestinians must become Zionists. And in September 2009, he went before the United Nations and he says Palestinians must finally do what they have refused to do for 62 years. They have to say yes to a Jewish state. The problem here is that the Israeli quarrel is not with the Palestinians. Their quarrel is with international law. Because there's no requirement under international law that you have to recognize the legitimacy of a state. There's no requirement that you have to recognize the legitimacy of its ideology. You take the case, a comparable case, you take the case of India during the period of its struggle for independence. Mr. Gandhi, the Mahatma, as many of you probably know, was very much against the idea of Pakistan. He used very strong language. He said on many an occasion, the idea of Pakistan is a sin. Now, there may be Pakistanis in the room who take deep offense at that, but Mr. Gandhi's position was Hindu and Muslim Indians were one people. There was no Muslim nation. And he was very emphatic, as he put it, the partition of India was artificial. It was, to use his words, it was poison. But Mr. Gandhi said, I have to acknowledge it's an accomplished fact. I can't change it. I'm forced to accept it, but I refuse to believe in it. Those were his words. It's an accomplished fact that he was forced to accept, but which he refused to believe in. And now when you look at Hamas's position on Israel, I'm now quoting from the American study, it says as follows. Hamas draws a very clear distinction between Israel's right to exist, which it consistently denies, and the fact of its existence. And it has stated explicitly that it accepts the existence of Israel as a fait accompli, an existing reality, an established fact, which is to say in simple language that Hamas's position on Israel is identical down to the words. It's identical to Gandhi's position on Pakistan. It's also hard to understand why Palestinians should be obliged to recognize Israel as a Jewish state or the Jewishness of Israel when 1 in 4 Israeli citizens is not Jewish. It seems that in order to obtain their own rights, Palestinians living outside Israel's borders are obliged to forfeit the claims to Israeli citizenship and identity of Palestinians living inside Israel. That doesn't seem sensible, and that doesn't seem reasonable, and it's clearly not in accordance with international law. So, now I will come to the end. About 20 or so years ago, 30 years ago, there was a very famous professor of international law. He may still be alive, I'm not sure. Adam Roberts.
Yes.
Adam Roberts is still alive? Okay. Excuse me? Okay. I was afraid he was in the room. That was
He was by the polite.
okay. Well, Mr. Roberts said about 30 years ago, there is still basic disagreement about what parts of international law are formally applicable to the situation in the occupied territories. But 30 years later, it's no longer the case. The UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the major human rights organizations, there is virtual unanimity, agreement on all the basic principles on resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the fact is, as anyone looking at the documentary record can tell you, that Israel, backed by the United States, stands alone in rejecting the fundamental legal principles governing a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict.